Hello, and welcome to the Effects Corner, a podcast about visual effects. I'm your host, Scott Squires. As always, if you have any questions or comments, you can submit them to the Effects Corner blog at effectscorner.blogspot.com or just go to effectscorner.com. Today I'll be covering part 2 of rotoscoping. In this I'll show you how to do a basic splining technique for rotosplines. I hope you enjoy it. Okay, so now let's get down to the nitty-gritty of actual rotoscoping. As we talked about, you can actually paint the rotoscope mats themselves, but with today's technology it's normally done using splines. When I do a paint podcast, I'll go ahead and show how to paint to the alpha channel and create mats that way, but normally you want to avoid the chatter or the jitter, so that's why splines are used. And splines are like paths in Photoshop, and they're also called mask in After Effects. So here's an example of your typical spline. I'm just going to draw on a section here so you can see it clearly. So this is a Bezier spline. It's the most common that you see in most illustrative type of programs, as I say, within Photoshop as well. I can split off one of the tangents or control handles and change the shape of the curve, and I can move these around. So I can go ahead and recreate just about any shape I want, and these are certainly very good for doing architectural things where I need a super smooth section followed by a very sharp change in direction. And just to show you the animated portion, if I go to a different frame, here I've selected all the points and I'm moving them and changing some of the values around. Now if I step through there, you can see it actually start to move. So that's how the rotosplines work. You try to do as few as possible. Now that's, as I say, that's the Bezier splines. Now part of the problem with them is just the amount of potential control points and other things. They're not necessarily the best for doing rotoscope type work, because every time you have to get one of these points directly on it, you have to get the tangents and the angles set just right to work. So let me go ahead and hide that. Your other option is a B-spline, and this is used fairly commonly for professional rotoscope work. And once again, everything I'm demonstrating here is done in Commotion. You can see that the points don't necessarily go through the lines. They're influencing them, but that makes it actually very easy to manipulate and just get gradual and nice smooth turns on things. If I do need a sharp corner, I can go ahead and manipulate the amount of control that affects. So here I can actually pull it in tighter and make a very sharp turn. And as with our other splines, I can go ahead and move this around and change its shape so that you can see it animate. So those were B splines, and those tend to make it easier to rotoscope. I'll go into a few more details here in a moment. Alright, so let's suppose that we want to go ahead and roto this actor walking through the frame here. So we've seen in the past, earlier in the podcast, showing you how you can place things behind here and manipulate them. So we've decided to go ahead and rotoscope them. Well, one of the issues here is trying to find, analyze the shot, try to figure out what we're going to need. And one of the ways of doing that is trying to analyze and find out some of the most complicated shapes that we'll have to deal with and just figure out how we want to approach this. Now, a lot of times people just want to go ahead and start outlining, creating a tracing around him. And this sort of works for the paint process, but the fact is, if you're doing splines, the problem is you've got all these little points that are moving and changing each time. So as his arms and legs start swinging in, and overlapping. Now we've got points that end up on top of themselves, and we've got gaps opening up and closing all the time, which cause problems as we're trying to move those shapes. The other problem you run into is you're constantly changing something on this. Even though his body may not be changing much, his bottom leg may be changing quite a bit. And you can see that there's a lot of motion blur and a lot of motion going on down here. So the idea is to break it into different pieces. And let me just show you that. Once again, I won't spend a lot of time detailing this type of stuff out, but the idea is to break it down into the different shapes and different areas. I'm using B-splines. The other thing I should mention, I'm using a Wacom tablet. This is a wireless pen that makes it much, much easier to deal with than a mouse whenever you're doing handwork such as this or painting. So here I picked something that was a fairly complicated shape just to get us started. And the reason why you want to do that is you want to try to get an assessment of how many points that you want to start with. You can add points later with some programs easily, but it's always best if you can go ahead and get it set up to begin with. In this case, I might actually be better off dealing with that foot separately. Now, this may look like a lot of extra work, but the fact is, as we move through here, you will see that his body section here, or his midsection, doesn't change that much, but this bottom leg changes quite a bit. So let's just step through that. I'll go back and select this mid body, and let me go ahead and I'll add in his shirt or his basic torso. And I actually want these to overlap here. And in this case, I will go ahead and tighten this up. Whoop. All right. Tighten that up and we'll overlap, because what will happen is when these are combined, and even though I'm doing this in Commotion, a number of these features have been copied by a few other programs. So even though the whole idea is that they're overlapping, and that creates one continuous mat. And if I go back a few frames, you can see that his actual torso and his midsection doesn't really change that much from frame to frame. They're moving around a bit. But the whole purpose of trying to do rotoscoping is to try to make it as smooth as possible. You don't have to worry about every hair on his head being captured with the rotoscope. What you have to worry about is making sure that it looks smooth and that the edges aren't too sharp, so that it just blends in and the eye fills in some of the little details. So in this case, I will go back, and so you want to try to put in as few points as you can get away with. And once again, that all depends on the type of action and motion. But in this case, I also want as few keyframes as possible. And let's suppose his body, I see it's going up here. Now it's starting to go back down. So I will go ahead and choose this point where his body is at the highest, and I'll use that as a keyframe. And I'll go ahead and just select all these points, and then I'll select all of the midsection and place those here. And let's go ahead and we'll just do a quick, section of his leg. And as I say, in hindsight, I'd probably go ahead and break out the foot as a separate thing. And now, one of the nice things with some of the better roto programs, I'll go ahead and select that as our pivot point. I'll just pivot his foot around here. And then I can actually select just this section and move that around as I so decide. Okay. And normally this is done at a magnified view, so I can make sure that I line things up And now if I step through here, you can see, okay, his body and his midsection's working pretty well. There's more work to do here on the foot. We'll come back to that in a moment. And he follows through. Now he comes to another point here. And if you're familiar with animation, we're seeing him come up and go down. So these are what I would consider the key points. So now I'm going to select his body here and place that. And just go through the shapes. And down here. Now we want to pivot that leg around. Alright, and then we'll bring in our lower section of the leg, and once again I'll do a little bit of pivoting on it. Okay, so this is working fairly well here as a rough starting point between those keyframes that we've seen. Down here I will definitely have to do some more work on it, so I'll go ahead and select all those points again, pivot that, and I can also go ahead and just grab these, and if it changed shape or size I could go ahead and handle those types of things as well. Okay, so okay, and so what you want to do is go through and pick out your keyframes, things where something changes quite a bit, and you can see different parts of the body change at different times. And so I'd go by the keyframes and then step through frame by frame, and once again trying to find something in between. I notice it's fitting sort of well here, and then sort of well here, but in between. So I try to pick kind of a mid frame there. The idea is that it's going to interpolate between those and hopefully make those midpoints or mid frames match. At least do a reasonable job. Now in some cases with fast action you're going to have to manipulate on a frame by frame basis, but by and large you want to try to minimize that type of thing. So here we can see it catching up and moving with him. I won't bother with all the frames here, finessing it. Let's just do a preview. Here you can see how the shapes have been combined. I'll just show you here. We've got the preview. So I can go ahead and actually manipulate some of the different shapes and cause them to be black on white or white on black, depending upon what I want to achieve with that. Okay, so you can see I've placed the composite right next to our clip just so that we can see them. I've synchronized them so we can step through. You can also, I think it's self-evident that the 4 and 8 point garbage mats and things like Final Cut Pro and other types of editing program would not be suitable for complex rotoscoping tasks such as this. You can also, I know people have done things in Photoshop, but that was one of the reasons why I wrote Commotion, is to avoid having to do frame by frame type of work in Photoshop, because it was never meant for dealing with motion and for being able to analyze and check your work right away. So let's just play through here. You can see obviously I'm missing his head, although that's kind of an interesting look, and his arms and his other leg. You can also see it tend to flicker and strobe. We're not lined up in certain areas here. I should also mention a lot of times rotoscopers will do just one shape and do that through the entire shot, and then add a second shape and do that all the way through. In this case I've kind of added multiple ones just so that we could go ahead and start working on it. Let me bring these closer. Hopefully you can see that clearly. You can see here with this leg that we've got, it's not lining up, which is obvious here as well. So I'll go ahead and move that over and because I do have the composite handy, then it becomes fairly easy to check to see how well that work is going. We can make some final tweaks here. Let's go ahead and select this upper leg section. Okay, so that's working better. Now the idea, as I say, it doesn't matter if we cut a little bit off the person or do things like that, as long as it doesn't pop out. We'll go ahead and adjust this a little bit. So go ahead and make those types of tweaks, double check it. As I say, try to minimize the number of places where that happens. Now the problem is right now, of course, we have very hard edges with all of this. So to get around that, we can add a certain amount of feathering. Let's just take a look here. And here you can see that softened, and that just looks much more natural right now. That's like 3 pixels in video. Video 1 to 3 pixels is probably a good starting point to work from. Down here, we'll go ahead and add a little bit there as well. I'll just put in a couple so that we have that. So it just softens it just a little bit and takes the curse off of it. Commotion was probably one of the first programs for rotoscoping that had things like built-in feathering to this type of control. And here bumped that up, the upper leg up quite a bit. And the other thing that I can do within Commotion is go ahead and blur inside or outside or center. As you can see, I've shrunk in the matte, shrink that even further, or I can go ahead and bleed it outward, and you can see that difference here. And that allows you to have the flexibility if you've got a little going beyond the edges a little bit. Normally I rotoscope right in the middle of a blur, but if you want to tighten that up a little bit, that's one way to do it. The other thing that you have, once again in Commotion, and now some of the other programs are starting to get some of these features, is you can turn on motion blur. And here's in Commotion, just so you can see. You've got your different feather values here, and inside matte, outside matte, or centered on it. And then these are your motion blur. And what happens with the motion blur is it automatically calculates if you have a shape that's moving quite a bit, frame by frame. I'll go ahead and move off of here. If you have a shape that's moving quite a bit, then it will automatically generate the motion blur for you, just like you had a real object moving. And because it's based on each shape, you get, in this case, you would get the automatic leg blur, and that would once again help it make it appear as natural as possible. And that's part of the critical thing. Now, as I turn on motion blur and some of the blur factors, you're going to see it here. Let me see if I can move this around a little bit so we can get something even more. Yeah. Oh, I need to turn on the motion blur in our preview settings. So let's see how that's... So here you can see the feathering that's taking place strictly from the motion blur itself. You can see I haven't turned on any kind of blur for this section here. I haven't turned on the motion blur. So you can see quite a difference between these. And this feathering is what gives you that natural edge. The hard edge here will give you a strobe effect, which catches your eye. That's probably one of the biggest things that I see when I look at the rotoscope type of shots, is if there's no blur in that section. So anyway, that's, really it in terms of rotoscoping. I mean, there's the, that's the basics. You can add points, change things, but the basic concept is to create shapes that you can move throughout the entire shot, and that have as minimal number of points as possible, and break up your complex shape into multiple simple shapes, each with their own motion, and try to see if you can feather them as well as add motion blur to them so that they will appear natural. And just go to what you would consider your key frames. I mean, if you look at these legs, if it's here at an angle, it's come to a stop, so I'd roto here, and then as the leg comes to straight up, I would roto, move the shapes to here, and hopefully it'll go ahead and do the in-betweens reasonably well. But if not, as I say, go in between those two, manipulate it, and then hopefully in between those two. So you just start subdividing the work down and just step through it. Well, that wraps it up for the Effects Corner for today. Thank you for watching.